myself, but see, it's recording already. Oh, we got 2 people already in. And I have a list of agents that are taking it. I don't know where the list is. Check it later. Welcome, everybody. We have 2 more minutes before the start of the hour. If you would like to, the chat box always says I can't, not everybody can do it. So I got to figure out how to change that. Everyone, there, chat box is fixed. So you should be able to type in the chat box where you're currently located. That will help a little. Also, if you are a agent with the extension agent with the University of Kentucky and you're trying to get continuing education credits, yeah, just let me know. And you have to be here at the beginning and the end. So make sure you tell me you're here at the beginning and tell me you're here at the end. I have the list. That's not it. Okay, 1 more minute. 1 more minute. People. Okay, it's 3 o'clock. So we will get started. Try to do it on time for those that do show up on time. My name is Dr. Jackie Jacob, and I am the, what do they call me? The Poultry Extension Project Manager here at the University of Kentucky. And as part of that job, I am the coordinator for the Small and Backyard Flocks Community of Practice on e-Extension, which is the electronic version of the National Cooperative Extension Service. We have been doing monthly webinars for several years now. They are all recorded, including this one, and posted online via YouTube, so you can watch all the recordings. I will post our web page and Facebook page where you can find that information. And as I said, we do one every month. So this month we're going to look at home incubators. And Ron Kean from the University of Wisconsin was kind enough to volunteer to do the presentation for us. So I will turn it over to Ron, but while he's presenting, I will turn off my sound and video. And if you have a question, you can either type it in the chat box or the Q&A. I will be monitoring both. If the question directly relates to what Ron is talking about at the time, I will pop up. You'll see my video come back on and I will interrupt him for clarification. If it's not directly a clarification of what he's talking about, we will hold the questions to the end. But if you're like me, I can never remember a question if I have to ask it later. So typing it while you think of it is always fine. So feel free to do that. I will monitor the questions. Okay, Ron, it's all yours. I will be on mute and no video.
All right. Well, thanks, Jackie. I will talk a bit about incubation. I will say I've tried to be pretty, I'll say simple with this. I'm going to start really very basic. So if you've had some experience with it, you may already know a lot of this material, but I wanted to start out with basic stuff. And so We'll talk some about this. I've tried to focus on really the small hobby incubators. We could do a lot of stuff with bigger ones, but I think this will go well, hopefully. So a little bit about what I want to talk about. First of all, some of the different incubator types. I don't have a lot on that, but a few things for you to consider there. We'll talk about some pre-incubation things. So picking eggs, storing eggs, getting ready before you actually start incubating them. I'll talk about some incubation conditions. We'll talk about those and some of the different things there. A little bit on hatching, a little bit on cleaning and disinfecting after you've had your incubator, and then a few other things that I think can fit into this. So again, we'll kind of work through this. So first of all, if you're really just getting started on this, you know, there's a lot of different incubators that you can look at. So a couple things I think you want to consider when you're doing this. The first thing I would say to consider is whether you would look at a still air or a forced air incubator. And first of all, a still air incubator is one that doesn't have a fan. Okay, so the air is theoretically still inside the incubator. These can be very inexpensive. You see this picture, you know, you can basically use an insulated cooler and a light bulb and a pan of water, and you can have an incubator. Now that's very inexpensive, and hopefully, you know, that's not the easiest to use. And so that, I would say, tends to be the big negative with still areas. I think they're more difficult to manage. Okay. We'll talk about the forced air having a fan, but the big key to that is that circulates the air, so you should have much better temperature distribution. In a still air incubator, it's typically cooler at the bottom, warmer at the top, because the warm air will rise up. So one of the problems with a still air incubator is, where do you measure the temperature? Okay, and I said here measure at the top of the eggs, and that's generally what's suggested. If you can have a thermometer at the top of the eggs, and generally they're going to be set a little bit warmer than we would think of with most incubation. So usually around 101 degrees at the top of the eggs. We'll talk more about temperature later, but that's a little bit warmer than I would typically suggest. Okay. Here's another example, and I might be lying a little bit because this one may have a fan in it, but you can get these styrofoam incubators pretty inexpensively, especially the ones that don't have a fan in. Okay. The alternative, as I mentioned, is a forced air incubator. And I would really suggest, if you can get a forced air incubator, it's worth it to pay the extra and have that. As I mentioned, that fan will circulate the air then, and you should get better temperature distribution. It should be very similar in temperature throughout the incubator. There still could be some warmer and cooler spots, but it should help a lot. So here are a couple pretty common examples that you might find for these incubators. Okay. The other thing that I would look for when you're looking at an incubator is, if possible, get one that has auto turning. We're going to talk about turning here in a few minutes, but you really do want to turn the eggs. So as you see in this picture, the eggs are sloped, and every hour or so, they're going to turn and tip the other way. There are some others that will just rotate and turn, but it certainly will save you a lot of labor if you can get an auto turner. It also tends to be more consistent because, again, you can do this every hour or every 2 hours or whatever. If you're going to be hand turning, you're probably not going to be there, you know, every few hours to turn the eggs. So I would say, if you can, go for the auto turner. So some considerations I would suggest when you're looking at buying an incubator, or cost, of course, is going to be a part of it. And you can pay a lot, or you can get some pretty inexpensively. Now, you may want to think about, how long they're going to last. Some of the styrofoam ones can fall apart fairly quickly. So that cost may be factored different ways, but we look at that. The space, the number of eggs you can incubate. And I would say for most of us, you probably want to plan for more than you think you would need. This tends to be the case with most of these poultry experiences, is you end up wanting more than what you thought you would originally. So I think, if you can have room for more eggs than you think you might use, would probably be good. Along with that, I think flexibility as to the size of the eggs. You might think, well, I'm only going to do chicken eggs. Well, then maybe all of a sudden you get into some quail eggs and you need something that will hold a lot smaller egg. Or maybe you get some duck or goose eggs and you need something that needs bigger. So try to find one. And a lot of these will work with different size eggs, but it might be a consideration. Another thing I would look at is hatching capability. And, some of them, you'll just hatch them right in the same compartment as where they're incubating. A lot of those that have trays for eggs, you probably are going to want something flatter to hatch them. So kind of look at that. Most of them incubators will have some sort of a hatching area or hatching tray involved. Finally, I think probably one of the key things I would suggest is something that's easy to clean. If it's something that you can, hose out or scrub out, that will be helpful. We have some wooden incubators, and it's not quite ideal to try to clean those. So something that's coated is easier to clean than, say, a wooden incubator. So I think all those things are some considerations. While we're talking about sort of forward planning and planning ahead, think about where you're going to keep this incubator. I would suggest having a well-ventilated room. We're going to talk about the need for ventilation and air for the chicks and embryos later on. So, make sure it's somewhere there's good fresh air. Consistent temperature, and I said 60 to 70 is good. You can have some variation there, but that's probably a good place. You don't want it to be in a really hot area because it'll have trouble then ventilating the incubator. You don't want it in a really cold area, or it's going to be constantly heating to try to keep up. So something there is good. Consistent power supply. This may not seem like such a thing, but depending on where you are, this can be a challenge. So make sure it's a place where the power is not going to go off. I've heard about some problems in schools where they would shut unplug things at night, and people would come in the morning and the incubator's been unplugged all night. So those are some considerations. And then secure. You don't want it to be knocked around, falling off of a table, things like that. This is a picture of our hatchery in our lab. I'm not sure it's quite ideal with these tables, but it seems to be pretty secure up against the wall. So that gives you some ideas. One thing that I'm going to comment on, and I'll say this again toward the end, but I want to mention it here, is I'm going to talk about a lot of these different conditions. And I would say quite often incubation is not all or nothing, okay? You can have some very poor conditions. Things might really be challenging, and you'll still get some chicks to hatch, okay? I've seen some that hatched out of some pretty nasty conditions. On the other hand, even if everything is ideal, you're probably not going to have 100% hatch, okay? Even our commercial hatcheries that really do things very well, they may get 80–85% hatch. So keep those things in mind as I talk about a lot of these conditions, that, you know, we want to make it as good as we can, but there is going to be some situations both ways. So that's a little bit on sort of pre-planning, getting your incubator, getting this placement for it. The next thing I want to talk about is kind of getting the eggs ready and using those. So first of all, we can talk about, you know, having eggs from healthy breeders, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but there's certainly information out there about that. Feeding your breeders a good, healthy, nutritious diet, having them healthy from disease so that you get good, healthy eggs. They, of course, have to be fertile. We don't do too well incubating infertile eggs, so you'll have to have roosters there with them. Okay. Then picking the eggs, and I would say clean and intact shells. For the most part, I would suggest not washing the eggs. There are a few situations where people might wash eggs, but I would say visibly clean is best and not washing them. And relatively fresh. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes as to how long you can keep the eggs. Another situation that I hear about a fair amount is shipping eggs. I've done some of this myself. It's, you know, sometimes it's necessary if you can only get the eggs that you want from a distance. It can be pretty challenging for the eggs. So hopefully they've been shipped in pretty good conditions. There's pretty good evidence that it's best to let them, I'll say, rest a day, let them sit so that they can kind of settle down. There's been probably a lot of jostling and vibrations and things while they've shipped. So let them sit before you put them in the incubator. Okay. A little bit more on which eggs to use. And I guess maybe this is more which eggs not to use. But again, I mentioned having them relatively clean. Don't use dirty eggs. You'll probably create a lot more problems with rotten eggs, bad things there. Don't use cracked eggs. And I put this picture on. I think this shows pretty well. You can get these eggs with these small cracks in them that may not even hardly show up. They kind of look like a little line on the egg. That egg is probably not going to hatch. It's probably going to lose a lot of moisture over incubation and probably not do well. So avoid those eggs with these cracks. Misshapen, wrinkled eggs, again, probably aren't going to hatch. Overly large or small, and this is something that you'll have to kind of gauge depending on the breeds you have and things like that. But it's probably not going to do well, and the chances of hatching out of those overly large or overly small eggs is probably pretty slim. And then I put in here a question that I get a lot of times: what about double yolked eggs? And I would say in almost all of your time, you're probably wasting your time and incubator space to put double yolked eggs in there. You can find on the internet probably some example where somebody had 2 chicks hatch from a double yolked egg, but the chances of it have got to be 1 in 1,000 or less. So you're really probably wasting your time setting those eggs. Let's see. So that's kind of the eggs I would suggest then: clean, not cracked, not misshapen, things like that. I mentioned that we wanted relatively fresh eggs, and there's some interesting things here, I think. You can store eggs. This is kind of an amazing thing to me about birds' eggs, is that you can cool them down and store them for, you know, a week or so. And that embryo is actually partially developed inside the egg by the time the egg is laid from the hen. And so there's been studies where it's something like 40,000 to 60,000 cells in that little developing embryo at that time. And then you cool it off and it stops, which I always think is a pretty amazing thing. So you can do that. Typically, we would suggest 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit for that cool temperature storage. I would say below 70 at least. If you get above 70, you run some risk of some development going on there that's not good. Relative humidity, you can be a little more off here, but typically we would suggest fairly humid, so 60 to 80% relative humidity. That can vary a little depending on how you're keeping the eggs and the eggs themselves, things like that. The other thing that I would say, and I tried to show this in a little picture here, if you're storing the eggs longer than 10 days from the time they were laid to the time they go in the incubator, there's some evidence that turning them can be helpful, and you don't have to turn each individual egg. You can do just what I showed here. If you have the eggs in a case or a box, put a block underneath the box, and then the next day, move the block over to this other side so they tip the other way. So it's a pretty simple thing, and you can keep them moving. I would say daily would be a good suggestion for that if you know you're going to store them. Okay. Kind of an interesting aside, and I'm probably getting long here, but if you think about say a duck or a goose or something, or a turkey out in the wild, she may lay 10 to 12 eggs, and they will take certainly then 10 to 12 days before she'll start incubating. So certainly not unusual. All right. I've already kind of said some of this. Ideally, we would store the eggs less than 7 days. If you go longer than that, your hatchability may start to decrease. Okay. Avoid some drastic changes. Keep them a consistent temperature if you can. Don't have them, heating up and cooling down. And this sweating is when you get water condensing on the egg. When you take a cold egg and put it in a hot environment, it will do that. That tends to be not so good, and you can get more bacterial problems with that. So that's my part on storing the eggs pre-incubation. So now you're ready. You've got the eggs collected that you want to incubate. We'll talk about some of the incubation conditions. And I always think of this with this mnemonic that, okay? Temperature, humidity, air, and turning. And those are the conditions that I think about for proper incubation. So I'll talk about each one of those in a little bit of detail and go through some of the key points there. So the first one that most everybody thinks about with incubation, right, is temperature. And that's certainly an important one. And I would say for most of the poultry species, we would look at 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit is recommended, okay? Remember I said in a still air incubator, it could be a little warmer, but assuming you've got a fan, 99.5. And it needs to be fairly tight to that. A couple of degrees either way is about all the leeway you have. Maybe I could expand this to 97 and 102, but I would say those are not good. So 98 to 101 is typically what we would want to see. And even at those conditions, you're likely to see more problems in the chicks. Remember what I said earlier, you probably will get some chicks to hatch, but not as many as you could have, and you'll probably see problems. So if the temperatures are excessively high, we quite often see more deformities. I've seen chicks hatch with crooked beaks, with small or missing eyes, things like that that you'll see that are often due to high temperatures. You also see this excess albumin. You'll see the chicks look a little bit sticky because this albumin dries on their down. Unhealed navels, and I'll show you that in the next slide. The navel should close well right before the chick hatches, and if they hatch a little bit early because the temperature was high, they sometimes don't close, and that can be bad. More malpositions where they're not in the egg properly, and then they have a hard time hatching. And actually, they may hatch, but then they don't do as well after they've hatched either, and that can be from high temps. Too cold, they're late. They take longer than we would expect for the 21 days for the chicks. And again, they may not do as well after. Here are some examples of poor navels. So if you look at the belly of the chick, this one on the right it's not ideal. That chick will probably be okay, but you see this little scab here, and that can be an open area then if the chick is put down on litter or a brooder, you can get bacterial infection there. This one is pretty bad. You can guess that would be a good opening for bacterial infection. You can also kind of see some of the sticky look to the down on this chick, that it just wasn't quite right. So again, 99.5 would be what I would shoot for the temperature. Humidity, and I would say this one again can vary some. Typically, most incubators will say 50 to 60% relative humidity. That can vary a little bit by the egg, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. It gets a little deeper than maybe we need to, but you may have to adjust this according to the eggs that you have. And so eggs with thinner shells tend to lose moisture more quickly, and therefore you need to have a higher humidity so that they don't lose too much moisture. On the other hand, if they have really thick, solid shells, you may be able to have lower humidity so you do get the proper water loss. So again, this gets a little bit in the weeds, but I'll talk you through this if you're interested in it. I think it's something to think about. So years and years and years of research have shown that the eggs need to lose probably 11 to 14% of their weight during incubation. So we need to pull water out of the egg during incubation to get that weight loss, okay? And if you really want to test this, and I don't know that I'd say do it all the time, but you may want to, you can actually measure this on the egg. You would need a pretty accurate scale and weigh the egg, and then calculate what 14% of that weight is. You could go with 12% if you want, but somewhere in that range. And then you can actually weigh the egg during incubation and see how it's doing. And you could chart this on a graph. So you want it by about day 19. So when it's ready to hatch, to have lost about that 14%. Now that's getting pretty technical again. I would say unless you're really having hatchability problems, I probably wouldn't suggest doing that, but it's something you can try if you want to. A little bit easier than that is maybe what I'll call sort of eyeballing it. We're going to talk about candling here a little bit later, and you can get an idea of the size of this air cell when you candle, and you can gauge it by that. If they are not losing much moisture at all, then your humidity might be too high. If, on the other hand, they're losing way down here, almost half of the egg, your humidity was probably too low, and you're going to end up with some dehydration problems. Okay. You can also get a little bit of guess of this by looking at the shells after they've hatched, and the chick is going to hatch or punch out of that egg probably around about the area of this air cell. So if the chick is hatching way down here, halfway down the shell, that's a sign again that your humidity was too low and they've dried out too much. So you can get an idea of that by where this circle is on the shell. So temperature and humidity. Oh, a couple problems that you might have. If the humidity is too high and you're not losing that moisture, the chicks can look kind of overly large with their bellies, is one problem they can have. Again, you might have unhealed navels, which I showed you. You can have these red hocks, and this is something to kind of look at. This is on the hock area of the chick, the back of the leg there. And if that looks red and bruised, like you see in this picture, that's a sign that they struggled getting out of the egg. And so that can be a sign of high humidity. Decreased hatch can be a problem. And again, they may not do as well afterward. Okay. Now, if you really have high humidity, you can also get some problems with oxygen, which we're going to talk about ventilation in the next couple slides. So, too low humidity, they may hatch early. They'll again have problems hatching. You may see that they're kind of just dehydrated and down in the egg and not able to hatch. Again, poor production after. One other thing with humidity, generally at hatching time, we want the humidity to go up. And so a big thing there is we typically want to keep the incubator closed during hatching time, because when you open it, you let out a whole bunch of humidity. And so that can be dry then. The humidity will go up when the chicks start hatching because there's moisture from them hatching and drying off there. But this can help keep them from drying out. And you sometimes see this if the humidity is too low, they get like almost leathery membranes and get stuck in the egg. So what do you do about this? Well, quite often you want to add more humidity, and so you really need more surface area for evaporation. And so having a bigger water pan with more surface area will give you more evaporation. Or you can add sponges to that water pan, and that will give you more surface area as well. So here are some examples. You know, you've got your water pan, and you can add these sponges again if you want to add more moisture in the air. I guess to decrease humidity, you'd want to cover some of that up or use a smaller water pan. All right. So the third condition is ventilation or air. Keep in mind, these are living embryos, right? So they're going to need oxygen, and they're going to need to get rid of carbon dioxide. If you've just got a few chicks, you know, a couple dozen eggs, yeah, this generally isn't going to be a big problem. If you've got a lot of eggs in a small area, it does become an issue, and you need that fresh air. But even with just a few, you still need ventilation and need fresh air. So you want to make sure the vents are open on your incubator. And this can get to be a bit of a struggle because, okay, I want to keep it closed up to try to keep the temperature up and keep the humidity up, but I also have to open it to let fresh air in. So you will have to figure that out with your incubator and make sure of that. Okay. One of the things, and this is again getting a little bit deeper into it, but inside the egg, the chick doesn't really have carbohydrates, sugars to use for energy. And so they need to use proteins or fats. Well, the proteins you want them to use for growing down and muscles and things like that. So you want them to use the fats for energy, but they have to have oxygen in order to do that. So that can become a problem if they don't have enough fresh air. The other thing that's kind of interesting with this is how they actually get that oxygen inside the shell. And probably most of you are aware of this, but the egg shell, even though it looks very solid, has thousands of pores on it. So the oxygen and CO2 and water vapor can actually move in and out of that eggshell. The chick then grows this, what's called the CAM, the chorioallantoic membrane, inside that shell, and that's how they're going to get oxygen and get rid of CO2. So these blood vessels that you see inside the shell were what they were using to breathe, if you will. And you kind of see that here. This is growing around the inside of the shell to get that. Interesting aside, and I don't think I have this in the notes, but when they're ready to hatch, they actually pip up into that air cell and they stop using these and they shut those off. So that's where you can see these still in the shell there. They left them after they hatched. All right. The other thing about the air, I would say, is it is the most important right at the end of incubation, because that chick is as big as it's going to get and it needs the most oxygen. When it's the first few days, it's a little tiny embryo, doesn't need very much oxygen. So we often see problems right at the end when the chick is fully formed, needs more oxygen, and then maybe doesn't get it. Okay, so that's a ventilation. You do need that fresh air. The last one is turning. And I would suggest multiple times a day is best. There's been research, probably once an hour tends to be ideal. But if you're doing this by hand, 3 times a day can be effective and can be enough. But I would try to shoot for 3 times a day at least. So morning, noon, and night would be good if you're doing it by hand. If you're doing it automatically, then it's probably going to be set up to be every hour or 2. Couple things about turning. It helps to develop that chorioallantoic membrane that I showed you. And so if the eggs do not turn, that sometimes won't grow around the entire shell. So then they can have problems later on getting oxygen. It also helps develop some other tissues. I usually kind of jokingly say when I talk to little kids, especially, it's exercise for the embryo, right? It makes it, they develop some different things. People talk about sticking to the shell. I don't know if that's really much of an issue, but if that helps to think about it, you can think that. So the effect of not turning, quite often what you see is, as I said, the chick does okay until it gets right up to the end of hatching when it needs more oxygen, and then it dies because it didn't have enough oxygen. You can also get increased malpositions. The chick isn't in the egg properly. You'll see them upside down sometimes. You'll see them with the head under the wrong wing, things like that. They also will have residual albumin. So again, like I said earlier, you get these sticky looking chicks because they can't use all of that albumin. While I'm talking about turning and malposition, this is another problem I see a fair amount, is people that somehow get the egg upside down and the small end is up, and then the air cell is at the bottom and the chick develops and it doesn't work very well. So I would highly suggest you incubate small end down or laying horizontal if it's an incubator where they just lay flat. Now, I hesitated when I said I'd do this talk because I always get these questions, well, why didn't my eggs hatch? And it can be very challenging to try to figure out exactly what is happening with these things, especially because some of these can affect each other. So if the ventilation isn't right, that can affect the temperature. If the ventilation is too open, it can cause low humidity, right? I talked about how turning, they may not develop the cam right, so then the air can actually be a challenge. So it does become difficult to try to troubleshoot these because of some of these interactions. So those are kind of the conditions. Talk a little bit about hatching. Generally, if you have a separate hatcher, you would turn this down slightly, so about 98.5 degrees. If you're having eggs still incubating and you're trying to hatch in the same incubator, I would leave it at that 99. But if you can, lowering it a degree can help. As I mentioned, increase the humidity. And generally, you want to stop turning. I've seen a lot of chicks hatch in the turners, but it's not ideal. You want to stop turning the last few days would be best. Okay. Mentioned keeping the incubator closed because you can keep the temperature steady, you can keep the humidity up, so that's best. And those chicks that have hatched, there's going to be variation in time. So some of the earlier ones, they can stay in the incubator. They have that residual yolk to live off of. So I wouldn't get in any great hurry to get them out. Let them dry off. They'll be fine in there. Now, the other thing about hatching, and you'll find this everywhere, we don't recommend assisting the hatching. That being said, I know a lot of people will try. You've got a chick, it tips through, it's cheeping, you want to help it out. And so that's fine, you can try. A couple things I would suggest, be careful, pick gently at with the shell with tweezers and just take little pieces off. If you're going to do this, if you see blood, if you see the chick is bleeding, I would put it back in the incubator and wait a couple hours before I would move farther. Okay. It may not be ready to hatch yet. It needs to shut off those blood vessels outside and get ready to hatch. The other thing I would say is sort of be prepared, because you may end up having more problems with the chicks if you're going to do this. You may see crooked toes, you may see some problems with navels, things like that. And there may be reasons why those chicks didn't hatch. So kind of prepare yourself for that ahead of time if you're going to do that. All right. So that's kind of the incubation hatching. A couple things after the hatch. You can wait maybe an extra day if you want for late hatch, depends on your situation. At some point, you want to dispose of the unhatched eggs, shells, things like that. I would say for me, if you have access and can do this, put those unhatched eggs in a plastic bag and freeze them. Then you don't have to worry that there's something late hatching and run into problems there. That tends to work pretty well, I would say, is to freeze them. Then you want to clean up your incubator, especially if it's at the end of the incubation season. Dry clean it as much as you can. Take a brush or something or air pump and blow it out, get all that out. If it's a styrofoam bottom and the components are on top and it's really dirty, you can soak it if you want. This will depend on the incubator you have. Soapy water and a bleach solution, 99% of the time is going to be effective. You probably won't have real problems in there. And so use those, clean it up. And then I would say allow it to dry thoroughly before you store it for next time. Doesn't have to be real, phenomenal, but clean it and use that bleach solution and that will work well. All right. Couple other considerations, I would say. I talked about candling, and probably most of you are familiar with this, but if you aren't, this is shining a flashlight through it. This is an egg on the left, is an infertile or a fresh egg. This one has this embryo developing, okay? And you can see this chorioallantoic membrane that I talked about is all these blood vessels. Here's just a picture to show you similar thing without the shell. So we have the embryo and then we have all this extra membrane out here. Couple things about candling. After say a week or so, you should be able to tell if the eggs are developing or not. If they're clear and you can see that there's no development, they're probably infertile or early dead and you get rid of them. If you see something like this, that means the embryo died. We call that a blood ring. I would remove that as well. You can also, and hopefully you won't find them very often, but you may run into rotten eggs. Oh, I just cringe when I see this, but that's, if you see this, you want to be very careful because that egg can explode if you're not careful. But if you see one oozing, you'll probably smell it before you see it. Be very careful and remove that. Couple other things I would suggest is some record keeping. This is a chart we use down at our hatchery, and it just keeps track of temperature and humidity, and we try to do it twice a day. If I was redoing this, I would probably add a turning column as well, just to mark whether the eggs have turned. Or whether they're left or right, so that you know that. But we don't have that, but I would probably put that on there. Some other record keeping you might do is just keeping track of number of eggs set, number that you candled out if you're going to get the idea of infertiles, number hatched, and then you can keep track of how your fertility was, how your hatch of fertile. So simple things, but you can keep track of those. Another thing that I would highly suggest, if you keep no other records, keep track of when you set the eggs so that you know when they should hatch, okay? And this is especially true if you start using mixed species. So you have chicken eggs and duck eggs or turkey eggs or pheasant eggs or something in there. Because it can get really confusing, and then you have chicks hatch when you didn't expect them, and it's kind of a mess. So that's something I would highly suggest. You can write that right on the egg. It works quite well. That kind of brings me to another thing about mixing species. Ideally, we wouldn't. Ideally, you would have all eggs of the same species so they would hatch at the same time. Conditions are pretty similar. So if you're hatching chicken eggs and turkey eggs, for example, you can probably do those in the same incubator. I would try to synchronize the hatch dates. The turkey eggs are going to be a week early, take a week longer. So you need to set them a week earlier so that they would all hatch at the same time. This will help with your, stopping turning and closing up the incubator, etc. The other thing I'll comment is egg sources and mixing these. It's probably not ideal. It would be best if you used all the eggs from a certain source from a disease standpoint. I know that not everybody does that. So, you'll have to kind of deal with that and see. Couple other things, and I know I'm getting toward the time here, so I'll try to leave some time for questions. Something that I think you might consider, and this isn't for everybody, you'll have to decide if it's something you want to do, but sometimes you can learn a lot by breaking out the eggs that didn't hatch and see some of the things there. Now, I would check first that they're not rotten, so if you candle them, that would be best. I speak from experience there, but that's best. And then, look at those that didn't hatch. How was that air cell size? Was it really small? Was it really big? Were they dried out in the egg? Sometimes you'll see a cracked egg and it'll be just dried way down, and you can get an idea there. Look at the size of the embryo. Did it die right at hatching? Did it die at day 13, right? You can get an idea there. if it's toward the end, was it in hatching position? And you can find this, the chick should be head at the top of the egg, underneath the right wing. So it should be in that position. Look for deformities. Was there something wrong with the chick and that's why it didn't hatch, right? Now, again, as I said, this isn't for everybody. So if it bothers you, that's fine, but it might be interesting. I put this picture in. You can find lots of these online, but if you are going to break them out, you can get an idea of the size and get an idea of when it might have died. Okay, so if you see something that's, you know, this size, even though it's the 21st day, well, it probably died at about that 11th day. Okay, so you can get an idea of those. I think that's mostly what I have. I would say, again, I would just kind of end with this, is to realize that this isn't, quite often is not an all or nothing thing, okay? You may get, you know, 50% hatch, and that's maybe not bad. You may get 20% hatch, and then you'll have to figure out why. Again, even ideal situations, 85, 90% hatch would be quite good. So keep that in mind to think about. The last thing I have, if you don't want to do any of this, then you can get a broody hen and let her incubate them, and she'll take care of most all of that for you. So that's certainly another option. So I think with that, hopefully that covers some of the things. And I see if there's questions.
Yes. Oh, you answered the question I had. So does anybody have any questions? You can put it in the chat box or the Q&A. I am watching both. I have also put in our website. It does have links to the recordings, but I did put in our YouTube channel where they all are. You can go directly there, as well as our Facebook page is there as well. We post a variety of different things. So we still have a few minutes if you have any questions. Next month is a build on this one. It will be specifically on trying to hatch waterfowl. It's a little bit different because of the humidity requirements and things like that. If you ever have an idea for something that you would like to see as a webinar, just email me and let me know. I usually start working on next year's around July or August. So always getting new topics that we haven't covered or recycling ones that we do have, which is always interesting. Yeah, also remember to wash your hands anytime you handle chicks or eggs. Every year we have an outbreak of salmonellosis in humans traced back to backyard flocks. So make sure that anytime you handle anything to do with any type of poultry, whether that's the birds, the eggs, the incubator, the feeders, whatever, wash your hands with soapy, warm water.
Yeah, I just had a call the other day from a family that had Campylobacter too, they thought from
backyard
flock.
Yeah. I haven't seen that on the CDC site, but I think last year there was like 1,200 plus people who got sick. 5 or 6 of them were hospitalized and 2 died. So if you go to the CDC site and look for the salmonella stats related to backyard poultry. I haven't seen any for this year, but this is usually when we get them.
Right.
But they have to verify them first before they post them on the website. So, okay, so I'll expand. So, as I said, for the University of Kentucky, Kentucky State, please just type your name in the chat box to the hosts and panelists so that I can verify you stayed to the end. It's a requirement for the KERS, continuing education things. So, any more questions? Seems like you did a really good job there, Ron, because nobody's asking any questions. That's always a good thing.
I mean, I think, yeah, this was hopefully pretty basic stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, well, we still have the incubators in the classrooms. Do
Yeah.
you restrict on how young you can do it in the classroom?
We don't do very much of that up here. There's been a few, and historically we have not. I've even done some preschools and things, but I don't, there's less and less of it going on.
Yeah. It's quite a big program here in the counties, and we don't recommend doing it in kindergartens, but I know that Tony Pescatore used to do it in a kindergarten, but that was because his wife taught it. So he went there for his wife. So, the webinar was recorded. It is still being recorded and will be available online shortly. So you can see that shortly. Again, thank you very much, Ron. You did a great job. Good luck getting all your work caught up, just like me, and have fun in Minneapolis next week.
All right.
Okay, take care, guys.
Thanks.
Let me turn off the stop recording.